Homer's Greek epic, The Odyssey, is a foundational work of literature. Kind of the archetypal tale of a war hero's struggle to return home has always transcended its original era in culture to speak and resonate with new audiences. Now, much like Odysseus himself, the modernized film adaptation directed by Christopher Nolan must navigate its own sort of stormy cultural seas to find its way home. And there has been a lot of anticipation and controversy and just strong opinions about this film. Is it a masterpiece? Is it a modernized corruption of a classic, or something else entirely? Well, I have finally seen it, so let's talk about it. So this was one of my most anticipated films of the year, even if I actually wasn't super impressed with any of the trailers for it. But I will get right to it. I think The Odyssey is a cinematic masterpiece, showcasing Christopher Nolan in full command of his abilities with an epic tale that, despite some of the online discourse, offers a surprisingly conservative tale about the importance of preserving the good, true, and beautiful as the foundation for a flourishing society. Now, much of the controversy about this film has been aimed towards the casting of Lupita Nyong'o and Elliot Page, and I'll get to that later, but it's actually the casting of rapper Travis Scott that may prove the most consequential. The film actually opens with Scott in the role of a bard, reciting the story of the Trojan War, and in press interviews before the movie, I saw that Christopher Nolan explained the surprising casting choice as a nod to the story's oral tradition. And even the story itself unfolds largely through sort of non-linear flashbacks and memories. In other words, I think questions of historical accuracy or fidelity to the source material are obviously valid, but I think they miss the point of what Nolan is striving for here. I think the cinematic telling is meant more as another telling in the oral tradition, one more concerned with preserving the soul of the tale rather than all of its specific narrative details. I should say too that I've read The Odyssey before, but purposely didn't reread it before this film because I wanted to experience this just as a story and not just as an intellectual exercise to compare it to the source material. After all, I think it's entirely possible for The Odyssey to be both a great film and a poor adaptation, in however you choose to measure that. So I'll leave the question of its faithful adaptation to others, but setting aside those concerns, The Odyssey is a visually stunning film with an epic scope rarely achieved. I don't think it is crazy exaggeration to say that this stands among the most just cinematic films ever made. In terms of just sheer production quality and scope, I think it is a film that just demands to be experienced on the big screen. Whether it's the use of a 60-foot puppet rather than a CGI creation for the Cyclops, or just striking shots of the ships at sea, the commitment to sort of old school movie magic results in something that feels so immersive and tangible and even a bit nostalgic. For the actual story, Christopher Nolan not only pulls from Homer's epic and also Virgil's The Aeneid, but also extensively from his own filmography, particularly I think the Dark Knight trilogy and Oppenheimer, because this is very much a quintessential Christopher Nolan take on the story. So as with his Batman films, Nolan grounds the fantastical in a sense of realism. For example, the opening title card of this movie sets the backdrop as a time of apparent magic, and Troy is not sacked just because of Helen's beauty, but also for political motivations to control trade routes. And I think for the most part, the grounded tone really does work well and gives the story a sense of weight and even a dose of horror. At the same time, when the more supernatural elements are included, such as the famous Cyclops or a tentacled monster or a company of giant warriors, they did feel a bit jarring. I think the world that Nolan has created is often thrilling, but not always cohesive. I think the individual moments all work on their own, but don't always fit seamlessly into the bigger picture. The story is also stretched almost to the point of snapping. I think Nolan's ambitious narrative scope is not always able to do full justice to each of the characters and the storylines, although some, I think, such as Anne Hathaway, I do think provide some really great performances. The story never feels slow or boring, despite its very lengthy runtime, since there is always another impressive sequence just around the corner. I think as with the source material, the narrative is a bit sort of episodic and repetitive. Essentially sail, stop at a new island for provisions, discover some new supernatural horror, flee for your lives, and then repeat. But I think what keeps the story from becoming too disjointed or like redundant is its thematic unity, because each of the episodic adventures is not just an excuse for more spectacle, although they also do that, but they are also like lessons that further both Odysseus's sort of external and internal journey home. In one scene, Odysseus's son, played by Tom Holland, declares that despite not learning anything about his lost father's whereabouts, he has gained something just as valuable, saying something along the lines of, "You didn't tell me where he is, but you told me who he is." And that really is, I think, the core of Christopher Nolan's vision with this movie. I think beneath the modern alterations to the mythical tale, this is still the story of a husband and a father whose Odyssey is, I think, as much, if not more, like an emotional and spiritual and like moral journey back to the foundational and like guiding principles of his life, as it is like a literal return home. And despite plenty of criticism from politically conservative commentators, Nolan's modern adaptation arguably moves the tale like more in line with a Christian worldview than it does away from it. I think the skin color of some characters may be different, and like the language is definitely more modern. I think at times jarringly so, such as some very needlessly strong profanity. But Nolan has also like drastically toned down the original tale's sexuality and offers a central message about the need to like cling to tradition, honoring the faith and like moral codes of our past, rather than give in to our carnal nature in the present. Of course, it is fair to wonder whether like Nolan himself honors this message through the film, and so I wanted to at least touch on some of the film's controversies, even if they prove to be mostly much ado about nothing. For example, besides being a beautiful and highly accomplished actress, Lupita Nyong'o's casting as Helen makes total narrative sense like within the context of the film, and her role is shockingly minor. I didn't have any issue with her as Helen, and like, if anything, she's probably underused. I do think the concerns about the casting of Elliot Page are more valid. Page has a much more prominent role, and like repeated flashbacks with the character played by a young male actor makes the casting of like a biologically female trans actor for the adult version seem just a bit more blatant. That being said, despite online rumors, Page is not presented as like a hyper-masculine Greek war hero, but rather as a humble civilian drafted into the army that may be too like delicate for the battlefield. In other words, the significance of Nolan casting Page as a male character may be a troubling affirmation of like progressive sexuality, but there's nothing like within the story itself that necessarily promotes any sort of sexual agenda. As far as content and consider things going on the surface of this, for language, there are 3 very unnecessary F words, as well as several other sort of minor profanity. For violence, despite its R rating, the on-screen violence is, I think, surprisingly toned down. Characters get hacked and slashed and shot with arrows during battle, but the blood is never very like overtly graphic. In one scene, men get eaten by a monster with various like limbs falling from its mouth, but the scene happens mostly like within shadows that conceal the worst of the horror. Also, in one scene, soldiers massacre women and children while capturing a city, but the violence is like implied rather than really shown on screen. And also, there's a scene in which a witch molds men's faces kind of like clay into the form of pigs, which is a little bit disturbing. For sexuality, really not a ton here either. You do have several men that are shown nude from behind, and also some like female siren creatures may or may not be nude or scantily dressed. I couldn't really tell because they are only visible kind of at a distance and concealed in fog. You also have a husband who lays back on a bed wearing only his underwear as his wife approaches him before the seemingly intimate moment takes a very unexpected turn. There's also just some kind of immoral sexual activity that is implied or just alluded to, such as soldiers that are said to have raped women during their pillages of towns, and a husband that is implied to have had sexual relations with another woman, although he is drugged and unaware at the time. As far as themes, worldview, things going on beneath the surface, much of the tale is kind of based on Zeus's law, which is a sort of golden rule that promotes hospitality and grace and mercy. And the law suggests that characters should treat all people with respect and dignity, because you never know when they may actually be a god in disguise, similar to the angels who visit Lot in Sodom in Genesis 19. And this ancient code is presented as sort of the bedrock of society, with the beauty of Troy elevated as sort of an ideal of civilization. And it's the breaking of this law through the Trojan horse, that uses the gift of hospitality as a means for violence, that starts the moral decay of civilization. Now, to be clear, the Greek gods are vindictive and petty, and so not comparable comparable to the true biblical God. But in some ways, the film represents like almost a more Christian approach to the pagan story. Odysseus' declaration, "Then I defy the gods," was the tagline on the movie's poster, but in the context of the film itself, that mindset is framed very much as a negative, where like, Odysseus' trials and tribulations are suggested to be like a direct result of this defiance of resisting like divine fate and breaking Zeus's law. And his eventual moment of like triumph and rebirth, which happens in a moment of very symbolic kind of baptism, comes when he finally surrenders to the will of the gods and takes responsibility for his actions. I thought it was interesting too that earlier when an evil witch transforms Odysseus' crew into pigs, she refers to their human form as their disguise. She sees men as nothing but gluttonous swine, kind of driven by base desire. And so like, the journey at the heart of this film is to overcome that human nature. So while the film's message obviously has like a pagan outer wrapping, Christians can affirm its central value of fighting to hold on to the good and true and beautiful of the past within like a changing world of carnal sin and desire. Christians may not endorse Zeus's law, but I think we can all agree that if left to our own sort of sinful nature without any sort of higher religious standard or code, then civilization is indeed doomed to crumble. In the end, Christopher Nolan's vision for the Odyssey, I don't think will please everyone, and I think that's okay. After all, not even Homer's epic itself is universally enjoyed. I think not every creative decision works, but the film is nevertheless, I think, a stunning achievement, a cinematic experience worthy of standing alongside like the great Hollywood epics, and a film that will almost certainly be a player at the next Academy Awards. It's the type of film I think modern audiences should want to be made, one that values sort of movie magic over hollow spectacle and strives for thematic and like philosophical depth that most modern blockbusters simply don't. In a film about the struggle to hold on to the values of the past, Nolan's The Odyssey shows both the beauty and the difficulty of like holding true to those convictions. And amid that very messy struggle is, I think, a thrilling experience and one of the best films of the year. But hey, I would love to hear what you think. Obviously, let's all be respectful, but don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't done so too, I encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a collider. Got lots of other movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.